are a priori concepts of objects. Okay? So it's not going to be a method that talks about the external world, but about this a priori grid, this lens, these subjective structures. A system of such concepts could be called transcendental philosophy. That'd be a huge undertaking. But then on 376, you notice that division 2 is entitled Transcendental Philosophy. And he says it's an idea for a critique of pure reason that would trace, according to fixed principles, a plan that guarantees the completeness and certainty of all parts of which the building consists. Trying to get at that a priori structure, as it were, the plan for the building of knowledge, the blueprint that's subjective, you see. And accordingly, when you get to elements of transcendentalism, transcendental aesthetic is an attempt to apply it. Now, after the initial definitions that I was talking about there on 377, the very bottom of the first column, you'll find this. In a phenomenon, something that appears to you, something you experience, I call that which corresponds to its sensation, the sense stimuli, its matter. But that which causes the manifold matter of the phenomenon to be perceived as arranged in a certain order, I call form. So form and matter. Where did he get those terms? Well, you might say he maybe got it from aesthetics in the other sense, where you sometimes talk about a painting in terms of its matter and its form. But no, I think it's really Aristotelian. You see, where Aristotle talked of particulars as having form and matter, physical particulars, Kant is talking not of physical particulars as having form and matter, but particular phenomena, particular experiences as having form and matter. Okay? So the empirical input, that's the matter of it, the subject matter of it, and here's the form. You see, the form and the matter. So now what he wants to do is to lay aside, to bracket, to put out of consideration the matter, the content of the experience. Never mind if it's apple pie, plum pie, raisin pie, or just plain dry bread. Leave that alone. What is it that is the structure of the experience of such things? You see, never mind particular colors, particular shapes, particular smells, etc. What's the structure? The structure of the experience. And whatever the kind of perceptual experience is, he's after that structure. Now look at the bottom of 377, that second column, or rather halfway down the column. Second column, if we deduct from the representation, from the Vorstellung, and you deduct from the representation, the Vorstellung, what belongs to the thinking of the understanding, substances, forces, divisibility, there still remains something of an empirical intuition. An empirical intuition, the Anschauung, namely extension, form. These belong to pure intuition a priori, regardless of what particular form there is. How large, how small, what shape. What they all have is spatial extension. Two-dimensional, three-dimensional spatial extension. And so there is a pure, not a mixed, but a pure intuition, a priori, without a real object of sense or sensation. A pure intuition that exists in the mind as the form of sensibility. you see. Now, the science of all such principles he calls transcendental aesthetic. And so, top of 378 in transcendental aesthetic, we must first isolate sensibility by separating it from the understanding, and then we must separate all that belongs to sensation so that nothing remains but the pure intuition, the pure form of the phenomena, the only thing which sensibility a priori can supply. And it appears that there are two pure forms of sensuous intuition: space and time. Now, remember, space and time for Newton were objective realities. For Kant, they are subjective forms of sensibility, forms of sense awareness. Huge change right away. He is subjectivizing the space-time structure of things. Now, let me add a footnote that looks on ahead. This is going to be very useful to him later on, when he's dealing with freedom and determinism. In a Newtonian world of space-time causal mechanisms, how can there be such a thing as freedom? Freedom of choice, freedom of will. Easy. If the space-time structure is something which is subjective, you can have objectively real freedom. So his distinction between phenomena and noumena, appearance and reality, makes it possible for him to have real freedom of the will, real objective moral obligation, a real God, which would be problematic were it not for the subjectivity of those forms. See where he's going? Yeah, he was raised a German pietist. While he didn't remain very pious, he at least seems to have retained concern for things like moral law, freedom and moral responsibility, and a divine moral lawgiver. And he wants to make room for that in a Newtonian universe. A Newtonian universe that is locking everything into causal mechanisms of a material sort in a space-time world. So if he can argue that that world of physical causes, space-time nature, is simply a subjective structure we impose on experience, you see, all the rest is possible. You see, so the conclusion of the critique of pure reason is going to be, well, there's a lot of room to believe other things. And in his other two critiques, critique of practical reason, critique of judgment, he goes on to argue for the other things. Well, the transcendental method, does that clarify, Esther? You look sort of dazed, but let's take it as it does. Now, what he's arguing, let's make sure we have it, is that space and time are not objective realities. Now, I suspect that this is the sort of thing that shouldn't take you by surprise. Because if by space and time you mean Newtonian conceptions of space and time, and if you're up to date on your physics, then you don't believe that space and time, what we think of as space and time in terms of modern physics, is simply relational possibilities. There's no such thing as an infinite expanse of empty space. That's nothing. The only way we can talk meaningfully about space is when there are physical events occurring and there are some sort of relationships that we call spatial relationships between them. Space is simply an abstraction referring to all possible such relationships. You see? Time isn't a thing. It's not made of elastic. You see? Time isn't a thing. It's an abstraction that refers to relationships between events. You see? Yeah, and you know perfectly well how the relationship is very funny. Time can drag, or it can race, as it does in philosophy courses, or it can stand still. You see? Yeah. There's no such thing as a fixed realm of time. Well, hadn't Berkeley said that from an empirical standpoint? You see? All right, now Kant is picking up, as it were, on that and saying, well, what are space and time? They're just subjective structures that we organize experiences with. Subjective structures. Our faculty of sensibility is so made that we experience things sequentially. Beep, beep, you know, and you expected a next one. Beep. Because we've learned to think sequentially. You experienced my former 3 beeps sequentially. You see? And you also know that after those 3 beeps, I gave you a brrr. So there it is. You see? But it's our subjective structuring of things in those relationships that he's talking about. And any Newtonian conception of time has no objective counterpart. Space and time both. And you'll find in reading the aesthetic that it's pretty obvious what he's saying. Look on 378, second column. Space is not an empirical concept derived from external experience. 378. And then number 2 at the bottom of the second column, space is a necessary representation a priori, forming the very foundation of external intuitions. And a couple of sentences later, it's a condition of the possibility of phenomena, not a determination produced by phenomena. Now, space isn't something produced by the sensory input. It is rather what makes sensory input possible. It's the precondition. The transcendental method is trying to identify the preconditions that make experience possible. What are the subjective preconditions that make it possible? And let's see, and then on the next column, number 4, space is not a discursive or general concept of relations of things in general. It's not a generalization, an empirical generalization. It's a pure intuition. It has no empirical content. You see? And then the conclusions